During a time when punk rock and heavy metal were miles apart in terms of musical style and the attitude of their fans, Motörhead defied convention by mixing both genres, profoundly impacting the rock and roll world as a result. By blending the elements of punk and metal, the band created a powerful, raw, and unapologetically rebellious sound, something that hadn't been heard before. This garnered Motörhead a solid fan base comprising both punks and metalheads. Over the course of their nearly 40-year career, Motörhead sold millions of records, earned a massive following of devoted fans, and established themselves as one of rock and roll's most influential bands. How exactly did Motörhead mix these two vastly different genres to revolutionize rock and roll? Keep watching as we explore the story of Motörhead and how their combination of speed, aggression, and a defiant attitude changed the complexion and perception of rock music as we know it. When punk rock and heavy metal both rose to prominence in the 70s, they were seen as two genres that existed on opposite sides of the rock spectrum. Motörhead changed all that by taking inspiration from both to create a sound that was original and would later be recognized as game-changing. The story of Motörhead begins in 1975 in London, England, 100 miles away from Birmingham, where a few years ago, heavy metal was born thanks to Black Sabbath. At the time, Lemmy was playing bass guitar for the psychedelic rock band Hawkwind. However, his stint was short-lived as he was fired from the band that year after getting arrested in Canada for drug-related issues. Lemmy already had a history of erratic behavior, and his arrest was the final straw for his Hawkwind bandmates who decided to let him go. Shortly after his dismissal, he formed a Motörhead with guitarist Larry Wallace and drummer Lucas Fox. The band's name came from the title of the last song Lemmy wrote for Hawkwind. The trio's sound from the get-go can be characterized as a rough, high-energy blend of punk rock and heavy metal that was unlike anything that had ever been heard before. But at the time, the sound wasn't described in such a manner yet. Lemmy personally didn't consider Motörhead as a metal band, a stance he maintained for the rest of his career. He simply wanted Motörhead to be fast, loud, and ferocious, and he took more influence from bands such as MC5 than the metal and punk bands that were on the rise then. To pursue this vision, Motörhead played fast tempos much like the punk bands and turned up the volume as loud as they can, giving them a heavy sound comparable to metal. Add to that mix lyrics about war, good versus evil, sex, substance use, and gambling, and Motörhead's sonic formula is complete. For the rest of their career, they stayed more or less faithful to this style, and while critics later debated whether Motörhead had more in common with punk than metal or the other way around, Lemmy always described their music as rock and roll. In fact, he opened live performances with the word, "We are Motörhead, and we play rock and roll." A few years after getting their start, drummer Lucas Fox was replaced by Phil "Filthy Animal" Taylor. Sometime later, the band decided it would work better with two guitarists and hired Fast Eddie Clarke as a second axeman. Original guitarist Larry Wallace quit after the auditions that got Clarke hired, and Motörhead remained as a three-piece. This trio of Lemmy, Clarke, and Taylor would be recognized as Motörhead's classic lineup responsible for the band's most essential albums and most famous songs. But things weren't always easy for the band, especially in the beginning. Feeling that the band couldn't succeed, Clarke and Taylor decided to leave and agreed to play a farewell show in April of '77. One of Lemmy's associates, Ted Carroll from Chiswick Records, decided to give the band a chance and booked them studio time for a weekend to record a couple of tracks. Motörhead ended up recording enough songs for a full-length album. 8 of those songs ended up on their self-titled debut album released in August 1977. Motörhead featured the debut of their mascot, Snaggletooth, and introduced the band to a wider audience. But sonically, it was still a bit far from what would be their classic sound. That would change with the release of their second album, 1979's Overkill. The album is considered one of the best heavy metals released, although again, Lemmy would prefer their music to be called rock and roll. One of the album's most notable achievements is the title track where drummer Taylor used double bass drums for the entirety of the song. Until that point, rock music didn't use 2 bass drums in such a manner, and Taylor even felt that drummers with 2 bass drums in their kit didn't maximize their use anyway. His use of rapid-fire double bass drumming on Overkill became instrumental in the formation of speed metal and thrash metal with drummers like Metallica's Lars Ulrich, Slayer's Dave Lombardo, and his mentor Gene Hoglan later becoming prominent users of the style. Several months after the release of Overkill, Motörhead released their third album, Bomber, within the same calendar year. The supporting tour for this album was notable for featuring a 40-foot bomber-plane lighting rig on stage. Motorhead were doing pretty good for themselves by this point, but their real breakthrough came in 1980 with the release of their classic album, Ace of Spades, featuring the title track and other raucous high-speed anthems like The Hammer, Jailbait, and the crowd favorite, We Are the Road Crew. The album was a critical and commercial success that helped cement the band's place as one of the premier forces in heavy metal. The title track is now considered an anthem for rock fans and Motorhead's signature song, and the album eventually became Motorhead's most commercially successful record. The band's next album, Iron Fist, would be the last album to feature Motorhead's classic lineup. That same year, they recorded an EP in collaboration with the Plasmatics, which included a cover of Tammy Wynette's Stand By Your Man, featuring Lemmy and Wendy O. Williams in a duet. Clark felt this was against what Motorhead stood for and left the band. Their next album, Another Perfect Day, featured former Thin Lizzy guitarist Brian Robertson handling guitar duties, but this ended up being both Robertson and Taylor's final album with the band. In 1986, Motorhead bounced back with the album Orgasmatron. This is the first album where the band performed as a four-piece. Prior to recording, Lemmy hired new guitarists Phil Campbell and Michael Wurzel-Burston, and drummer Pete Gill, who only performed on this album. Taylor returned to drumming duties for the next two albums, Rock and Roll and 1916, before departing again. 1992's March or Die featured prominent metal drummer Tommy Aldridge behind the kit, except on the track Hellraiser, which featured Mickey D. Following its release, D would become Motorhead's permanent drummer, making his debut on 1993's Bastards as a full-time member. Their next album, 1995's Sacrifice, was the band's last album where they performed with four members, as guitarist Wurzel exited the band shortly after recording for the album. Motorhead's 1996 album, Overnight Sensation, saw the band return to being a power trio, consisting of Lemmy on bass and vocals, Phil Campbell on guitars, and Mickey D on drums. This became the band's final lineup, lasting for nearly 20 years until the group ended its legendary run and managed to outlast Motorhead's classic lineup consisting of Lemmy, Fast Eddie Clarke, and Phil Filthy Animal Taylor. Throughout the rest of the 90s and the 2000s, the band continued to tour and release new music, earning a reputation as one of the most energetic and relentless live acts of all time. Since returning to being a three-piece, Motorhead released 10 more studio albums, 6 live albums, and several DVDs. Despite the band members aging, Motorhead continued to push forward with the same vigor, passion, and appetite for playing fast, loud, and hard. Lemmy, in particular, maintained his relentless, unapologetic lifestyle characterized by heavy drinking, recreational substance use, partying, and womanizing. A Channel 4 documentary in 2005 even claimed that Lemmy had bedded around 2,000 women in his lifetime. However, age eventually caught up to him, and as he got older, he lessened his drinking and drug use for health reasons. He eventually gave up drinking Jack Daniels entirely in 2013. By 2015, the consequences of his lifestyle were starting to show. He was hospitalized in August of that year for a lung infection that affected his breathing and live performances. His condition worsened to the point that he needed a walking stick to get by during his last months. Motorhead's final album, Bad Magic, was released in August 2015. 4 months later, on December 28th, Lemmy succumbed to cancer 4 days after celebrating his 70th birthday at the Whiskey A Go-Go. The day after his death, his remaining bandmates announced the end of Motorhead. Despite his passing, Lemmy's influence on the world of rock and roll continues to be felt, and he's remembered as one of the greatest frontmen in the history of music. Today, 8 years after Lemmy's death, Motorhead's legacy continues to inspire fans and musicians around the world.